So today we're going to talk about the theory of unemployment in Marx. But typically I need to start with the theory of unemployment, with issues of unemployment and theories of unemployment in other schools of thought which you're familiar with, so that you can see the contrast and see the implications. First of all, when we're talking about unemployment, at a concrete level, there are many different levels. But at the level of abstraction that Marx and, let's say, Keynes are talking about, the first issue is whether the unemployment is involuntary. That's a key factor that we're concerned with, involuntary unemployment. If you happen to be lucky enough to choose not to work, that's not counted as unemployed either in conventional accounts or in any theory either. The question is whether the people we observe as unemployed are really unemployed. Then there's a second category of unemployment which is frictional, and all measures of unemployment take that into account. Frictional means that you're on the way from one job to another, or you're between jobs but you're going to get a job, so that the unemployment is temporary and it's literally transitional. Everybody understand that? So there's always some element of unemployment which is like that. Then there's structural unemployment. Unemployment which arises because of a mismatch between one type of skill demand and the availability of that skill. An excess supply of lawyers, for instance, could be a source of structural unemployment. And that's always an aspect. But again, at the level of abstraction that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be abstracting from issues of sectoral and structural mismatch. We're concerned in the first instance whether or not there is a job for everybody who would like to work. In other words, whether the unemployment in question is voluntary, is involuntary or not. So we're abstracting from frictional, we're abstracting, all of those can be built back in. But obviously, if you have 10, 15, 20, 25% of the people unemployed who wish to be employed, then all the other factors are secondary. If you have almost everybody wish to be employed is employed, then the other factors will add a certain percentage. So we're clearly not talking about that at this level, though obviously concretely you do have to talk about that. And the last issue is in talking about unemployment is it's possible that there are some people who are unemployed who choose not to work, who are voluntarily unemployed. That comes up very much in the Friedman neoclassical version of natural rate, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. And finally, in talking about unemployment, we have to distinguish between people and hours. At a practical level, this is very, very important because it's possible for people to be working for just a few hours. And in the US and all national income accounts, all accounts, labor accounts, if you work any time at all in the week of the survey, because this is done by surveys, population surveys, then they'll call you up and say, do you have a job? Did you work last week? And if you say, yes, I worked last week, before you can even say for 10 minutes, you're counted as employed. That's how the official measures are made. So the official measure of employment that we have has to be taken with a huge grain of salt, because it does not take into account the length of your employment, the number of hours. Now, there are further measures, and I advise you to go on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and look at what are called expanded measures of unemployment, in which they take into account people who are employed for fewer hours than they would wish. In other words, they're fewer than a full-time employment. They also take into account the fact that people who cannot, when people cannot get jobs, they give up. They stop registering because there aren't any jobs. And those discouraged workers should be counted as unemployed. They're not counted as unemployed if you don't register with the state saying, I would like a job, even though you don't get one. And after a while, people give up. So that's typically in high unemployment areas, in neighborhoods where there are high unemployment, you get a lot of people who are discouraged. Then there's also the fact that there are people without documentation, and they won't come in, obviously, and say they're unemployed. So if you really want unemployment measures, you have to be careful. The last thing is that when you're looking at unemployment, it's relevant to know how long people have been unemployed. I won't get into that here, but if and when my book comes out, you will have a chance to look at it. I tried to make a distinction, which is available in the data, by the way, going back to the 1940s, I think 1948, a measure called the duration of unemployment. The duration of unemployment in the US, unemployment, as you know, has shot up. But what has really shot up is the duration of unemployment, the length of time that people have been without a job. And it's possible to combine the numbers of people who are unemployed with the length of time that people are unemployed to get a kind of measure which I will call the unemployment intensity, the intensity of unemployment. Now, I'm not going to show you any of that, but it's relevant to the discussion in Marx, because if you go back to that chapter 25, you'll see a whole discussion of the reserve army and the layers and the intensities and all of that, the pickup rate and the expulsion rate and so on. Okay? With that in mind, I want to start by talking about different theories of unemployment and the mechanism that is at play in creating or eliminating unemployment. First of all, Neoclassical theory. In its pure form, before Friedman's natural rate hypothesis, you have the idea that in a competitive market, any unemployment that is there will be eliminated through the movements of the real wage. Very important point, through the movements of the real wage, because you'll see Marx makes the same argument, only he gets persistent unemployment. So clearly it's not the flexibility of the real wage. But if you remember how the story goes in a neoclassical textbook, if you have unemployment, the real wage falls because the pressure of the unemployed on the employed will cause wages to fall. Either if you're employed and there's a set of people, as always, there's like, this is the employed pool and here's the unemployed pool. And if the unemployed pool is willing to work, then they're willing to go to the employers and say, look, I can work for less than her. Why don't you hire me? And then the person has a job has two options. Either they accept a lower wage or they lose their job and someone with a lower wage takes that. But then the fact that the employer is not paying less, this is a neoclassical version of the story, paying less to someone and a set of people means their profits are higher. If their profits are higher, they can expand. If they expand, they pick up some of the people from this pool. Everybody see the logic of that? So on this argument, as long as there are people left in the pool of unemployed, the wage will keep adjusting downward. Profits will therefore rise. Capital will expand its employment. And therefore, the pool of unemployed people will eventually disappear. The normal state in a competitive economy in neoclassical theory at this level of abstraction is full employment. Any textbook will give you this as a first part of any macro book, any micro book for that matter either, will give you this as the first part. Any about this? In the 1970s in the United States, a problem arose, which is that we got what was called stagflation. And stagflation was an era that lasted 10 years or more, in which you had inflation inflation actually going higher and higher, and you had unemployment rising. Now, on the neoclassical argument that I just gave you, if you have unemployment, you should not have inflation, because if you pump demand into the system and you have unemployment, you're going to pick up the workers, right? So the Keynesians who had that kind of argument, I'm going to come to that in a minute, had this difficulty that they were faced with the fact that inflation existed and unemployment was actually getting worse, which is completely contrary to the expectation. But the neoclassicals had the same difficulty, because for them also, if you have unemployment and you pump up the system through aggregate demand, deficit spending, war spending, you should get more employment but not inflation until you get to full employment. So both sides had the same difficulty. But one side won the battle. And that side was the argument made by Friedman and Phelps, especially Friedman, who said there isn't any unemployment, because the unemployment you see is actually due to the fact that the state has provided such great benefits to people who are unemployed that they're choosing not to work, so that they're not involuntarily unemployed, they're voluntarily. So they move from the involuntary to the voluntary column. In other words, employment is effectively at full employment. And that's why if you pump up the system, you'll get inflation. It's a beautiful argument, really, and got both of them Nobel Prizes. So apparently it was appreciated by the Central Bank of Sweden, which is a bank that gives out the Nobel Prize. So this argument solved two problems. It was able to explain rising unemployment by saying that there was further and further support for people not working. Support meant welfare payments, unemployment insurance, which allowed you to stretch it out, and generally a base level of standard living, so that workers didn't need to work because they could live without working. So the blame was on the state and the welfare state, particularly the welfare state aspect of it, which created and maintained a pool of people who were pretending they wanted to work by calling up and saying, I'd like a job, but they didn't really want to work.
So this is where Reagan's welfare queen
Yes. This is where all of that comes from. All of that ideology comes from. And of course, unemployment was highest among black people, so they were targeted as the ones who were really living off welfare and not wanting to work. So you can see that in this kind of story, the neoclassical story preserves its story from that moment on by defining a rate of unemployment which is consistent with the undermining of the market functioning, because it's consistent with the social institutional structure of the welfare state. And that Friedman calls the natural rate of unemployment. Everybody understand that? So the neoclassical argument in its pure form, the natural rate is 0. The system will give everybody jobs that they want. But if you start interfering with the system by giving a floor and support for people to not work and all that, then the natural rate is defined essentially to be whatever the unemployment rate is. Because in the theory, the unemployment rate will be 0. So if people are not working, it's because they choose not to work. And that led to the difficulty over time of redefining the natural rate to be that rate which you observe. And of course, as economists, you don't go out to the ghetto and say, look, I know you don't really want to work, because you wouldn't make it out of the ghetto. So what you do is you sit in your ivory tower and you run an econometric model. And the econometric model says inflation will begin at this rate, which happens to be the rate that you have today. Econometrics has many defects, but this is one of its gravest sins, that it replicates things and takes them to be sort of structural when often they are something quite different. But notice here something very important, and this is why I'm leading this way into it. Notice that here Friedman picks up an argument that says that we expect capitalism to have a persistent pool of unemployed workers. And that argument was before that only really argued from the side of Marx. That the normal state in capitalism is unemployment. And I'm going to come to why and how Marx did that. Now, this is a very interesting speculation about whether Friedman got this from Marx. In the book Keynes Hayek, which is a lovely book about the debate between the two sides, very beautifully written, I strongly recommend that you read that book. Keynes Hayek. I don't remember the author, but if you type Keynes Hayek, you'll see the rap video, which, by the way, I was told was produced by the Hoover Institute, which is why Hayek comes off so well in the rap video. It's about time we did our own version of these videos, but we don't have the money.
So Friedman was a bastard Marxist.
Well, so here's the thing. What it says in the book is that Friedman started off as a socialist.
Yeah.
He became a Keynesian, and then became Hayekian before he rejected Hayek and became Friedman. So, and I've never heard, I actually asked, I mentioned this when I gave a talk at Utah, and someone tried to look up. There are the Friedman archives and all that, but apparently that aspect of Friedman's life is not publicized much. And so I don't know what it means to say that Friedman started off as a socialist. So I'm speculating purely that, but it would be very interesting to know if you came from a Jewish family at that time, coming over from Europe, socialism was absolutely normal. And many of the economists, Baumol and Solow and others, came from this background. Klein was in the Communist Party, Lawrence Klein, who also got a Nobel Prize. So at that time, it was very common that people had exposure like this. And if you had any exposure to Marx, it'd be Volume 1 and unemployment, that was a big deal. So it's something I think would make a great paper if somebody can track this down. How much did Friedman know about Marx? Maybe as a socialist he didn't know anything, but it's very interesting. Phelps actually refers to Marx in his Nobel lecture. So he did know. So it's kind of interesting that orthodox economics arrived at and continues to maintain today that capitalism will maintain a pool of unemployed people, except these people are voluntarily unemployed. Yeah.
I know this is not your point of view, so it might be difficult to answer, but what would...
Well, in the abstract, that's a good question. If you look at Lucas's discussion in this book called Macroeconomics by Snowden and Vane, they have interviews with people. And Lucas is asked of this question, and he says, I know that there is a large number of unemployed people sitting just outside my university, University of Chicago. And if you've been in Chicago, you know right outside the university is a very poor area, ghetto area with large unemployment. And the interviewer doesn't ask him then, but then, Professor Lucas, how do you account for your idea of this natural rate of unemployment with all these people? And the issue just gets skipped. I'm sure they've been asked that, and I'm sure their answer will be that, in fact, these people are being damaged. I'm sorry, let me answer the question more precisely because I need to represent the argument properly. They would say that the wage is too high because of unions. That's the other cause of unemployment. If the unemployment is where the market clearing labor demand, labor supply is, the wage will clear it, right? Because it'll move down. So remember the story I told in the beginning? All these unemployed people will drive the wage down. If they drive the wage down, then the system's profits will expand, more employment will come, and little by little, even if they manage to displace other employed people, the people will be absorbed. But now, suppose that there are unions, and unions prevent this wage from being driven down. Then you will get unemployment here because these people refuse to lower their wage, and therefore they won't make room for the people who need work. Okay, so they might not linger on the $1 an hour part of the story, but at this level of logic you have an answer. That is, it's the welfare state and unions and generally these kinds of left liberal policies that account for the poverty of the unemployed people. And by the way, unemployed people have been persuaded in the Reagan era to buy this story. They believe it. They do agree. And there is some truth to it. I mean, you have to keep in mind that unions do keep up a wage. And by so doing, they may keep other people out. We know that. The question is whether the kind of unemployment rate that we're looking at now, or even in the 1970s. And maybe no one talks about this in the 1930s because we didn't have any of these social institutional mechanisms, could be accounted for by interference in the market. If you believe that unemployment is due to interference in the market, then logically you must say that you should eliminate unions or reduce their power, which is what Reagan did in practice in the United States, cut back on the welfare state, and basically get people off welfare, the end of welfare as we know it, is Clinton's motto, so that people will go back to productive work rather than hanging around. Yes?
I'm not clear on how we got to the point you were making earlier about how implicit in Friedman's argument is the idea that there will...
Yes, in fact, he argues that this pool of unemployed workers is not innate to capitalism. It's due to a specific historical moment where, due to Keynesian policies and due to the development of the welfare state imported from Europe, unemployment becomes a general phenomenon. So in fact, he's arguing that if you get rid of these things, you will go back to full employment. Yeah?
But in this sense, the union intervention isn't it part of the welfare state intervention? So in this sense, then the natural wage would still be the wage that we can observe. And if this is the link between theory and empirics, this doesn't even...
Well, but you don't quite do it that way, though the econometrics pretty much comes out that way. You build a model of this sort, and you ask the model, what is the rate at which inflation will start? And the model will pretty much give you something near the actual unemployment rate. Because models are constructed from a base in which the unemployment rate would be 0 if you didn't have interference. So the interference is going to produce the rate that you see. And it's not surprising. You can see that in the work of many Nehru writers and NRU is the natural rate of unemployment. Nehru is a little bit more extended version of that, which I may come back to. But the idea being that there is a rate at which inflation will begin to take off. And the models are constructed in a way that tends to give you that answer. And so when you find unemployment rising, then you'll find that the so-called critical rate is also rising. And when it's falling, it falls. And this is a well-observed phenomena of these econometric models, which leads some people to sneer at them, but they are very powerful in academia and have been for a long, long time. Okay, so now let's talk about the other side in the conventional discourse, which is Keynes, Keynesian Economics. It was Keynes's signal breakthrough from his own earlier thinking to come to the realization that the level of employment in a capitalist economy is not determined by the supply of labor, but rather the demand for the product, the effective demand. And that some particular level of effective demand, which is regulated incidentally by, above all, in a private economy, by the level of investment. Remember the investment multipliers story? You know, you have the multiplier. So that demand, I'm sorry, you have the idea of the multiplier, which is investment divided by the savings rate. And investment is a function of expected profitability, what Keynes calls the marginal efficiency of capital, and of the interest rate, because it's really about the difference between the two. This determines a certain level of aggregate demand through the multiplier effect and a certain level of output corresponding to that. And this level of output may not be equal to the full employment level. That should be familiar to everybody, right? So the point here is that if you have unemployment, it's because of a deficiency of effective demand. Now, of course, Keynesians understood that there's some involuntary unemployment. Of course, they understood there's some friction. In fact, they're the ones who picked that up first because they're the first ones to measure unemployment rather than to deny it. So they were definitely interested in the concrete elements of it. But it was their contention, beginning in the 1930s, that the bulk of the unemployment that you saw in the Great Depression was involuntary, was undesired by the people who suffered it. And they were willing to accept that in the 80s and 70s, some part of the observed unemployment might be due to people choosing not to work. But they still believed fundamentally that the bulk of it was undesired, was involuntary. Now, here's the problem, coming back to that moment in the 70s where Friedman and Phelps solved the problem. In that historical moment, faced with this particular argument that unemployment is a result of insufficient effective demand, the Keynesians believed that if you pumped up effective demand, it would reduce unemployment, but only when you got near to full employment would any further pumping up lead to inflation. Everybody see the logic of that? You know, if I'm pumping up the economy, I'm running deficits and having wars and other fun things, it's going to create jobs. And it's going to create demand, which is going to create output and employment. And as long as the economy has underutilized labor, it can keep expanding until it begins to reach, not exactly there, but some area close to full employment. Bottlenecks begin to appear in different sectors. As they begin to appear, you get price rises. And the tighter the economy becomes, the more general the price rise. John Robinson used to call that the inflation barrier. That's where the Phillips curve argument comes from. Now, from this point of view, you have either rising unemployment and no inflation, or you have unemployment and no inflation. So if there's rising unemployment, you might even have deflation. But what was happening historically, rising unemployment and inflation. And that was not possible to reconcile within this framework. They tried, of course, but it didn't work. One idea was to introduce expectations into the story, and that led to a series of chasing the tail. Expectations cause inflation, which causes expectations. But that was never quite used properly, though Friedman used it brilliantly. And in the end, the Keynesians were faced with the difficulty. They could not explain it. Because for them, the unemployment that they observed was really largely unemployment. It was people who wanted to work. So how could you explain rising inflation and rising unemployment at the same time? I will come back to that issue at the end, but that's a separate topic, whether the two are connected, because that depends on your theory. Now, one of the things, with that, as you know, Colettes Key has an argument very similar to Keynes in saying that effective demand through a multiplier, though in his case the multiplier has got a wage share and as a weighted average of the multipliers of the savings rate of the wage earners and profit earners, but basically the story is the same. Effective demand regulates the level of output. The level of output determines the level of employment, and there's no reason a priori why that should be at the level of full employment. Now, Keynes, when he was faced with the neoclassical, because he was trained, of course, as a neoclassical economist, it says, well, why is it then that if you have unemployment, wages don't fall in the neoclassical way, in real terms, so that profits will rise and output will expand and employment will expand and the unemployed will be absorbed? And Keynes, fudges that issue. He's talking about it in the context of the Great Depression, and he throws a bunch of objections up, which are well known. For instance, that workers lower money wages in the face of unemployment, but only with great resistance, because the wage is determined not by reference to the pool of unemployed, but the reference to other people who are employed. So there's a structural determination. But then he says, but it's true, if unemployment is persistent, then wages may fall. So he throws in another objection. Well, if wages fall, then costs will fall. If costs fall, prices will fall. If prices will fall, the real wage may not fall. Because if wage is falling and price is falling, the ratio of the two may not fall. Or if it does fall, it may fall slowly. And at this point, Keynes says, In any case, given all these objections, obviously we have a simple solution. We don't need to destroy people's jobs, livelihoods, maybe a whole generation or two with unemployment. We can step in through the state and we can create employment and eliminate that problem. And then when the system is back to normal, then we have the state step out of the picture. One has to remember that Keynes was himself a keen observer and participant in the politics of the 1920s and 30s. And it was already clear after World War I that the 1920s in Europe was a period of massive unemployment in many countries and misery. And Keynes had already arrived at the conclusion, and he says so in the 1920s, that the solution to it, he says, is to have the finance ministers of all countries simply print money and spend it, and this would pump up the world economy, and we'd go back to full employment. And he had already in his mind this practice before it was actually put into practice by Hitler. Mentions, Snowden and Vane mentioned that Hitler in 1 year moved the German economy from massive unemployment to full employment through rearmament. So he already had the practical understanding that it could be done. The problem for Keynes was how to get it into the theory. And so the theory of effective demand he struggled with was trying to explain how to accommodate this historical possibility and this historical fact. I saw a hand, yes.
Is that from the economic consequences of peace?
I think already in some of those essays he does talk about that, but where it's really laid out is in the Snowden and Vane book about Keynes' historical development. I can give you the exact citations actually because it's in my book, of course. So yes.
Actually, the forward to the German edition, he also refers surprisingly positive to the.
Yes, he was. I mean, you know, Keynes was a person who literally was a European citizen. I wouldn't say he was a world citizen, but he was a European citizen certainly, and could move back and forth, and certainly read and talked to, and could pick up the phone and call the prime minister here or write a letter to the chancellor there. So he was deeply involved in the politics of that time, and his theory was based on his understanding of what is practically possible, which is very rare because most in neoclassical economics it's the other way around. You have this ideal world, and then you confront the real world, and you have to explain it in terms of imperfections, such as interferences in the market. Now, Keynes's point was that this is what the market does. It maintains, it may maintain a pool of unemployed people if effective demand is not high enough. Unemployment is a distinct possibility. He even suggests that it may be the normal state, but it can be eliminated through proper policies. So, and Keynes himself says, look, I'm here to save capitalism. I'm not here to even attack neoclassical theory. I am saving neoclassical theory by showing the conditions under which it's operative, which is full employment. Those were fatal words because, of course, then neoclassical theory swallowed Keynesian theory back in by saying, look, he accepted this, this, and this. And this part that he talks about, the rigid wages and all that, that's a special case. If they were flexible, then you'd go back to neoclassical theory. So in many ways, his attempt to make peace with neoclassical theory by not being too critical of them led to a real problem for Keynesian economics. Keynes, as you know, died very young, relatively, in his 50s, and of a heart attack. And so he wasn't there for the big debate, so to speak. Okay? Yes?
Okay. I'm just posing this as a question, but restating what you just said. Basically, you're saying.
That's right.
And then
Well,
we're going to find out about Marx.
yes, we're going to find out about Marx, but we're going to take a few more digressions first. But let me repeat what I said. Neoclassical would say that in a world without interference in the market, full employment is the normal state. But if you have interference in the market, then you're going to have persistent pseudo-unemployment. That's a good word for it because it looks like it's unemployed, but people are sitting at home playing cards and watching TV and not working. Okay? So they're choosing to be unemployed. To put it another way, Friedman would say everybody who really wants a job has a job. Those who say they're unemployed are simply choosing not to work. Now, Keynes is saying, on the other hand, that there are many times in capitalism where it has people who are genuinely unemployed, who want jobs and can't get them, and willing to work at the going wage. So it isn't a problem if the wage isn't good enough. And so his solution to that is the state. The state, in a sense, realizes the potential of capitalism by completing it. And as he said, it also completes the neoclassical story. Though again, Keynes has many asides and digressions like Smith and Ricardo and Marx and many, many complications. So people can read in different ways what he had in mind. But those points are pretty clear. Any questions about this? So now we have a third strand, which is Colettes Key. As I said, Colettes Key has the same starting point. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one other thing. After he published the general theory, Keynes admitted that it's possible that if wages fall, in fact, inevitable at some point, that they will fall enough to raise profits and bring those people back. But his then argument was, but that would take a long time. It would cause a lot of social distress. And it makes no sense to do this because of all the wasted resources and wasted opportunities when you could simply pump up the economy and create the full employment right away through the state. So even if it worked, it would be destructive and slow. And therefore, in some fundamental sense, very inefficient socially when you had a much more efficient solution at hand. Okay? Now, back to Colettes Key. Colettes Key has the argument that effective demand can arrive at a level at which output is less than full employment output. In Colettes Key, prices are created through monopoly power, through a markup on costs. How many people have read Colettes Key or know about Colettes Key? Okay, well, Colettes Key is a typical monopoly markup argument in which the argument is that modern capitalism, at least in the 20th century, is monopoly. And in monopoly, firms create prices by marking up over their costs. They choose the profit they want. And that profit is their monopoly markup. It's dependent on various factors, like the degree to which other firms will follow and all that. But basically, it's an index of their ability to create above normal profits. And the thing with markups is that it has an implication for the wage, for the real wage, which is that the real wage is determined by the capitalists, not by the workers. Think about that for a moment. What a markup is saying that this is the amount of profit that I want out of the price and therefore out of value added. It's a profit relative to the costs, but the costs can be broken into prices and costs of labor, and the prices can be broken into the costs of labor and other prices. Remember, we did this in the Adam Smith decomposition part. So ultimately, a markup theory boils down to saying that prices are set as monopoly determined markups over direct and indirect labor costs. Now, in that case, if the firms set the markup, then they set the share that the workers get out of the total revenue and out of the value added. And you can show this formally in Colettes Key. Colettes Key makes this point himself, that the share of workers in wages and value added, the wage share, and if the real output is constant, the wage rate, the real wage rate, is not determined by workers, it's determined by the firm. Because whatever money wage they have, the capitalists add their markup on top of it. And by so doing, the capitalists determine the profit share they want, and the worker share is a residual. Now, here's an interesting aspect of the Colettes Key argument. Workers have no say, class struggle has no say in the determination of the wage or real wage or wage share. That's an argument which follows from markup pricing, and that's why most people don't take markup pricing to this extreme nowadays. But it has a very interesting implication coming from the side of Marx, that class struggle has no implication for the wage or for the wage share. Hang on one second. Colettes Key was aware of this, and because of that, in the last years of his life, he wrote an article trying to escape the argument, his own conclusion, in which he said, well, if this were true, then workers couldn't possibly affect their wage. We know historically the workers have struggled for and raised wages. So how could that be? And so within his theory, the only way that could be is if labor struggles put some limit on the markup. The threat of labor struggles made capitalists nervous about getting the full profit that they want. So they gave some of it to workers in return for labor peace. And so in a roundabout way, workers can have some impact. Okay? I bring all these up because no such argument will appear in Marx. Okay, while we're on this tour, how many people have read Harrod or know about Harrod? Well, I'll just say it because someday you may encounter it. Roy Harrod at Oxford argued that the rate of growth of an economy is determined by the level that it has to be in order to give you full utilization of capacity. That sounds very mysterious, but it doesn't really. Basically, investment has two effects. It determines output through the multiplier, but it determines capacity by the fact that it's the change in capacity that investment creates. Right? You think about it. If from the multiplier relationship, investment will create a multiplied level of output according to the savings propensity. But investment will also expand capacity, because what investment means is you're adding more plant and equipment and machinery, and that expands your capacity. So now Harrod says, well, you have a contradiction here. The level of investment may give you a demand which is not adequate to your capacity. And then he goes on to show, and I'm going to skip this derivation, but you can find it in almost any macro textbook, that the only way for output to equal capacity is if investment is endogenous. Because only a certain path of investment will create out a rising path, by the way. So output is rising. We'll create expansion of capacity such that it'll be the resulting capacity will match the output. This is Harrod's famous warranted path. And I'm interested in that for a reason. Because then the rate of growth of capital and the rate of growth of output, let's just say the rate of growth output here, the warranted rate will be equal to the savings rate over the capital. Savings rate is capital over capacity. And this is the only rate of growth of investment and of output at this level of abstraction of capital will be a growth path determined by the savings propensity and the capital output ratio. These are technological capital output ratios and the propensity to save. Now notice here, there's no room for any idea that wage and profit rates can have any impact on accumulation. And that caused an immediate problem, because coming from Keynes, where investment is a function of profitability, but capacity utilization is undetermined, to Harrod, where capacity utilization is determined at a normal level through endogeneity of investment, there's no room for profitability. And I'm bringing this all up because I want to show you that this connection of unemployment is linked to the theory of growth, the theory of inflation, even though right now we're only talking about the specific impact of unemployment on wages and wages on unemployment. Okay? If this is so, then again you have this problem. What happens with struggle of workers for wages? It apparently has no impact on growth, and profitability has no impact on growth. And that problem was addressed by people like Kaldor and Passanetti in Cambridge in the 1960s by saying we let the savings rate be the savings rate of workers times the share of wages in national, this is the savings rate out of net national income, plus the savings rate of capitalists, or the savings out of profits, times the profit share. In other words, the aggregate savings rate is a weighted average of the savings rates of the two classes of income, wage income and profit income. And that aggregate savings rate will then vary according to these classes, the distribution of income between wages and profits. Why is that important? Because in the Harrod model, if the growth rate is determined by these two parameters, there's no reason why there should be any relationship between the growth of capital and the employment of labor. In other words, this could be a rate in which the reserve army is rising without limit, or it could be a rate in which unemployment is sinking down to zero. This is only 1/2 of the problem. There's another issue. If you're growing at 4-5% a year, what does it imply for employment? And Harrod's point was that the employment, the rate needed to maintain full employment could be radically different than this, and you can't link the two together. And Kaldor and Passanetti said, oh yes you can. If you make the savings rate a variable through the distribution of income, then it's possible that the Herodian argument could be linked up to the idea of a growth path with full employment. Everybody follow me here? But here's the catch. The growth path through full employment would require the wage share, the profit share is just 1 minus the wage share, to be determined in such a way as to maintain the full employment of labor. So now we're back to this other paradox that we had in Colettes Key. Workers have no say in the rate of exploitation, so to speak, in the wage share, because the wage share is determined by the system in such a way as to give workers their full employment. And this was from the Keynesian side. So you have the neoclassical idea that you get full employment because what you see is full employment. Market delivers it to you. The Keynesian idea, the Colettes Key idea that the workers have no influence on the wage share, or maybe a limited influence. And then the Herodian and Cambridge Keynesian argument that the wage share is determined by the necessity to maintain full employment. Workers have no say. So it's a strange paradox in all of these theories that one of the enormous things of capitalist history, which is the struggle over wages and working conditions, disappears from macro entirely. And that's going to be crucial when we come back to the argument in Marx. Yes?
But in the Colette's reasoning, you don't demand effectively.
Yes, because it's a good question, because Keynes and Colettes Key are typically talking about the short run. And they assume that the effective demand will produce a certain level, investment produce a certain level of output, and investment is exogenous in the sense that it's based on profitability in the future and so on. The problem with that is that that level of employment is not the only concern. What's the level of capacity utilization? If, for instance, this level of effective demand gives you 50% capacity utilization, then that will not be a sustainable level of investment. And that meant that you have to link the issue to capacity utilization. Now, Harrod solves that problem, but then you get another problem, which is that there's no link to unemployment. When that's solved by Kaldor and Pasinetti, you get the problem that workers have no say in their wage at all. The wage share is determined by the necessity to give workers full employment, by the system's reaction to keep workers in full employment. And so there's a history. If you want to follow this, there's a paper on my homepage called, I think, Labor Market Theories in Different Schools of Thought or something like that, which traces this puzzle, this paradox, that conventional theories have no room for the idea that workers' wages can have any influence on accumulation, or indeed that workers can influence their real wage. Remember the Keynesian story. If money wages fall, at one time Keynes says, well, then prices will fall. If prices fall, then real wages don't fall, which means that workers, even if they want to have lower wages, cannot get lower real wages because they have no say. The system eliminates that possibility. So the question is really, what's the catch in all these arguments? Because if you think about it, clearly workers do have some say in real wages at the micro level. So is that false at the macro level, or is the theory itself problematic? I'm going to try to come back to that. In classical economics, let's say in Smith and Ricardo, there's not much discussion of the issue of full employment. But in the formalizations of classical economics, typically the argument is that the system adjusts to give normal utilization of capital, not the full employment of labor, but the normal utilization of capital. That is to say, capitalists make investments. If that investment expands capacity and there's demand for that, then output will expand. But if there isn't a demand for that, then they will cut back some of that capacity. Demand and supply will balance in some way. In Say's law, it pretty much balances if they expand the capacity, but it doesn't follow that the employment that they offer people, which is at the level of output matching capacity, is the employment equal to the supply of labor. In other words, it's entirely possible that there is unemployment. The neoclassical argument says, well, if you are a classical economist and your capacity is fully employed and you have unemployment, then the real wage will fall. Then you will expand capital and capacity more. You'll create more employment, and so you'll come back to full employment. So the neoclassical argument closes the loop. It's not obvious that that is the argument in Ricardo and Smith. It's certainly not in Marx. But it does link up the two things. Profitability determines the level of growth of the system and a growth of capacity. If that is not enough to match the growth of the labor supply, then the real wage will adjust and profitability will adjust, and you'll end up with full employment. So we come back full circle to the question, what is the difficulty in explaining unemployment? Where does unemployment come out of this story? Well, first, in the neoclassical argument, unemployment comes in if you interfere in the market. Since the market gives you full employment, unemployment is the fault of deviations from the market discipline. And that's the state, unions, cultural values, and so on. This is pretty much the mantra of the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF. We need more market-friendly institutions and policies. The code word in Europe is called labor market flexibility, which means reduction of union power, reduction of the welfare state, reduction of standard livings, and so on, to make it more flexible. Because in their argument, it's the real wage flexibility that creates full employment. Now, when you come to Marx, you would think that there's some deviation from this wage flexibility argument. But in fact, the main point that Marx makes is that it's the flexibility of the real wage that maintains a pool of unemployed labor. So the difficulty the difference between Marx and Neoclassical Economics is not on labor flexibility, though it might be with Keynesian economics. It might be with Colettes Key in economics, saying that the real wage is not flexible. Marx begins from the classical idea at that level of abstraction that unemployment will drive down the real wage. And that's in part because the price level in the argument in Marx is not dependent on the wage. You remember we talked a little bit about the theory of money in Marx. And the theory of money in Marx has some implications for the price level. Price level in gold of commodities is at a level of abstraction is the cost of the commodities, the price of production of commodities divided by the price of production gold. Or if at a higher level of abstraction, the labor value of the commodities divided by the labor value of gold. So the price level does not adjust just because the money wage does. So if a money wage falls, then it falls in real wage terms. And if it rises in real wage terms. So there was no difficulty for the classical economists to say that if unemployment causes money wages to fall, it causes real wages to fall. Okay? So now we come to the difficulty, or the key issue, which is on the basis of a flexible real wage, which is the same thing as the neoclassicals would argue, Marx ends up saying that you have a persistent pool of unemployed people. And there are two ways we can approach this. One is first to tell the story itself and then talk about formalization. So Goodwin, for instance, is a formalization, though there are other possible formalizations. So let me start by first saying that if it's true that there is a persistent reserve army of labor created through the normal mechanisms of the system, created and maintained through the normal mechanism system, then full employment is not a sustainable policy, sustainable state. Think about that for a moment. In neoclassical economics, full employment is a sustainable state as long as you get rid of the welfare state and unions. In Keynesian economics, full employment is a sustainable state as long as the state is there to help maintain it. Right? So in both schools, full employment can be a policy goal. They would come to it by a different method, but it's a policy and theoretical, practical situation. But if you argue that the system creates and maintains a pool of unemployment, then unemployment is not a sustainable state. I'm sorry, full employment is not a sustainable state. So how does that argument work? All right, I'll do it twice. First time you have to watch me wave my hands, and then the second time I'll do it again. So, right? So it's easier than the other way around. In chapter 25 of volume 1 of Capital, Marx begins by saying, let me for the moment abstract from technical change. So that organic composition in Marx's terms, or closely enough, the capital labor ratio is given here. If a capital labor ratio is given, then if capital grows, labor grows. The demand for labor grows, right? Not the supply of labor, but the capital to employment labor. The employment offered by unit of capital is given by the technology. So if capital grows, the demand for labor grows. or what determines the growth of capital? Profitability. So we are again in a world similar to the Keynesian argument. And indeed, at a more concrete level in Marx, the accumulation of capital is determined by the profit rate minus the interest rate, exactly as in Keynes. But of course, before Keynes, he didn't get it from Keynes, obviously. So now here's the story. You have to watch me. There's a pool of unemployed workers. The system is growing. As it's growing, it's picking workers up from the pool. As it picks up workers from the pool shrinks. But as the pool shrinks, wages start to rise. If wages start to rise at some point, then profitability starts to fall. If profitability starts to fall, the degree to which you pick up the workers slows down, because the growth rate of capital slows down if profitability is lower. That means the reduction in the pool slows down, and indeed, if this process continues, at some point you will reach a point where the wages have risen to the point where, as Marx puts it, they've blunted the impetus for accumulation. So the growth rate now becomes stagnant. Then labor supply starts filling the pool all the time, and the pickup rate is no longer offsetting the labor supply. The pool begins to expand. If the pool of unemployed labor begins to expand, the real wage begins to come back down. And as the real wage comes back down, profitability starts to pick up, growth starts to pick up, and the pool begins to shrink again. So you have the pool being filled by the supply of labor and being reduced by accumulation. But accumulation depends on the level of the pool itself. And if the pool gets too small, accumulation becomes weaker and the pool fills back up. If the pool becomes big, accumulation gets stronger and the pool shrinks. And this recurrent feedback loop, Marx argues, maintains a pool of unemployed labor, not just reduces it to the level of zero. So the story is almost identical to the neoclassical story, except with this one difference, that in the neoclassical story, the rate of growth of capital is equal to the rate of growth of the labor supply at a zero pool. And in the Marxist story, the rate of growth of capital is equal to the rate of growth of labor supply at a persistent pool. Now, you cannot tell the difference at this level, because obviously if two rates are growing together, that doesn't mean the difference in the level of those two variables is zero. It only means that the difference in the levels is stable. Let me say that again. You can have a growth rate of labor supply and a growth rate of labor demand. Oh, that's supposed to be a parallel line here. And these are log scales. And this is time. So if labor demand and labor supply are growing in a log scale at the same rate, which is what the slope of a log scale tells you, then the distance between them is constant. And that distance between them is the unemployment rate, is the degree of unemployment. It's the difference between labor demand and labor supply is the unemployment, is the degree of workers who are unemployed. Now, obviously, you can have the same. So this is in Marx. And in Neoclassical Economics, you have the same kind of diagram, except that in the equilibrium, labor demand and labor supply are growing at the same rate, and they're equal. So the issue is not the balance condition, so to speak, that the growth rates have to be equal. The issue is something else, somewhere else. Everybody with me here? I see a lot of hands. Yes?
It is necessary that the statistical...
Only at this level of abstraction. Remember, we started by saying we're assuming a way technical change, right? And we're assuming growth of a labor supply which is constant. So you wouldn't want to do that at a practical level. But it's very important to bring out the key point that even in the simplest of conditions, the difference arises in something underneath the commonality. And the commonality is that real wages are flexible and that profitability affects accumulation, and accumulation affects the pickup of labor. So that is the difference here. Okay? We want to specify why the two arguments which have so much in common, so to speak, can end up with a different thing. Now algebraically, algebra doesn't care. Algebra says, okay, look, they're both growing at the same rate, and mathematically that implies the difference between the two is constant. But it matters for politics a lot whether the difference is 0 or some fixed number, right? That's the key difference at this level. Yes?
I mean, the key point is basically the wage theory in Marx, right? So when we talked about surplus, we more or less assumed the subsistence wage.
Absolutely. The term in Marx of the necessary part of the working day does not mean subsistence level because he uses that term. It means subsistence in the other sense, a standard living, which is achieved historically through social conditions and class struggle. And that is a variable in the longer run. At some level of abstraction, you have to take it as given, but obviously at this level, it becomes a variable. And this is already in volume 1 of Capital. So we're bringing now an element of the variability of the wage, which is independent of the class struggle, but has to do with the unemployment rate. Now that affects the class struggle at a micro level. What that means is a lot of unemployment, it's very hard to fight for higher wages. If there's a low level of unemployment, it becomes relatively easier. So there are two feedback loops here. The wage depends on the level of class struggle and the level of unemployment, because that modifies the strength of the class struggle or the effect of it, right? Yeah. And I haven't come to the answer yet. So if you're asking why they are different, I will come to that in a minute. I'm just building up the case here.
Yes, I know there's no technical change there, but
Okay, well, you're becoming too concrete here. I'm going to come to that. At the moment, I'm just trying to lay out a problem, which is that the two theories are remarkably similar, except in a very key point, which is under the same conditions, one gives you full employment and the other does not. So the question is, where's the difference? And the difference lies in the understanding of what labor power is. And this is a point we forget sometimes, because labor power is an issue that Marx harps on again and again, the importance of labor power, the capacity to labor. It's something that you sell to the capitalist, you rent to the capitalist by the day or the month or whatever, and they extract as much labor from you as they can, but you're selling your capacity. You're not selling your time, you're selling the ability to do that, and then they get as much from as they can contractually or otherwise do. But that's a very important issue, because labor power is the one thing in a capitalist system which is not produced within the capitalist system. Moreover, it's not just a thing, it's human capacity. And here comes the difference between classical and Marx's argument. In the neoclassical vision of labor, labor is not different than corn or peanuts or machinery. It's a commodity with a price which is determined solely by demand and supply. And indeed, the price is determined solely by the movement of the price is determined solely by the excess demand or excess supply, right? Like any commodity. If you have an oversupply of clothing in a shop, then you dump it. You dump it because what else are you going to do with it? It's just a thing, and if you don't, it'll just be wasted. So you drop the price and you get rid of it. But in the formalization of these models, what comes out very clearly, and this is especially true in the Goodwin model, is that in Marx, let me more formalize this here. Here, the change in the wage, I'm going to put a little hat over it, in the real wage, is a function solely of the difference between labor demand and labor supply, the ratio of labor demand to labor supply, which is in effect the unemployment rate. The difference between that and zero, actually. So it's a percentage difference. I shouldn't write it like that. Let me write it like this. Labor demand minus labor supply over labor supply. That's the unemployment rate. And the rate of change of wages will respond to the unemployment rate in such a way that it'll arrive at a point where labor demand is equal to labor supply. It turns out that as soon as you introduce other factors into the determination of the real wage, in other words, you treat labor power as a socially, historically determined human capability, then right away this result will not necessarily follow. To put it another way, if you say that the wage is a function of productivity and the unemployment rate, and the function itself depends on class struggle so that it can move up or down, you won't necessarily get, you will get in general that there will be an unemployment rate at which the demand for labor and the supply of labor will be growing at the same rate, but it will be a persistent unemployment rate, or it can be a persistent unemployment rate. This is the secret to the Goodwin model. Goodwin formalized the argument in Marx in a particular way. There's some problems with that, but anyway, the first one to show that this logic in Marx of the feedback effect between the unemployment rate shrinking, the wage rising, profitability falling, the pickup from labor therefore falling, and the unemployment pool rising again, formalized it in a simple model that he borrowed from biology. It's called the Lotka-Volterra model of predator-prey interaction. Now, here's the analogy. If you have a pool of prey and you have some predators, what the biologists observed and formalized was that if there is a lot of let's say predator, yeah, a lot of prey, that is to say, let's say there are a lot of deer, and then the predator, the lions that feed on the deer, have a lot of food, and therefore they reproduce at a higher rate, and the predator grows more rapidly. As they grow more rapidly, they begin to eat more and more deer, and the amount of deer begin to fall. As that happens, the predators now have a scarcity in food, and their birth rate begins to fall. Their reproduction rate falls because there's a scarcity of food. And so then as their reproduction rate falls, more and more deer are able to escape and survive, and so therefore their pool rises, and so this movement goes back and forth. And what Lotka and Volterra showed was that there's a way to formalize it in which neither pool ever settles at a particular level, and notice that neither goes to zero, but rather they oscillate back and forth. They shrink here, and the predator, as the predator rises, the prey shrink. As the prey shrink, the predator begin to contract for lack of food. Then the prey start to expand, and this going back and forth can be shown as a formal, recurring, never settling cycle. It's not quite a limit cycle in the Lotka-Volterra version, but anyway, it's a cycle which repeats itself. And Goodwin, in a brilliant insight, takes the argument in Marx, the verbal argument, and maps it onto this predator-prey algebra, and derives a theory of the reserve army of labor as a persistent pool which shrinks. You can see here in the actual, as Robert Solow points out, algebraically labor is the predator, and capital is the prey because the variable is assigned in the model, the role played by the variables. But that doesn't really mean anything just except by the algebra. It's the mapping. As the reserve army shrinks, the wage begins to rise. As the wage rises, capital begins to shrink in its growth rate. As that happens, the pool of reserve army begins to rise again, and you go back and forth. Okay? Now, it's possible to formalize this in other ways. And I want to just make this point here that in the Goodwin model, this process leads to a persistent rate of unemployment. But that persistent rate of unemployment gives you a wage share, which is determined by the equilibrium rate of unemployment. And so paradoxically, you're back again at the argument that the wage share cannot be determined by class struggle. It's determined by the persistent rate of unemployment. And that's, in my opinion, a defect in the Goodwin model, a defect that can be limited by, explained and eliminated by more consideration of the feedback loops here. But it is kind of striking that even the Goodwin model ends up with workers have no say at all. The wage share is structurally determined by the interaction between unemployment and the wage share. Because the equilibrium wage share is that will give you this level of unemployment. Now I'm doing a lot of waving around here because I didn't want to get into the algebra here so much as into the logic of the argument. Hang on one second. In the next stage of the argument in Marx, he introduces the idea of technical change. And that, as he points out, strengthens this argument of a persistent pool of unemployed labor for the following reason. Let's go back to our story. We have a pool of unemployed labor, which is shrinking because capital is growing faster than the labor supply. I mean, it can be expanding, then it goes the other way. But any way you start it, let's suppose it's shrinking. As it's shrinking, the wage begins to rise. As wage begins to rise, accumulation slows down as some firms begin to lay off workers, and the pool begins to at least not shrink as fast. But now we have a further loop. As the wage rises, the mechanization rate begins to rise. The displacement of labor by machinery. So if that happens, then two forces are acting on. As the pool is shrinking, wages are rising, but growth is slowing down, so that makes the pool shrink less rapidly and maybe even begin to expand. But now you have a displacement of labor. So not only does the pickup rate slow down, but the displacement rate speeds up, and that is another mechanism that maintains a persistent pool of unemployed labor. Now notice that all of these mechanisms come out of the flexibility of the real wage and the workings of competitive markets. There's no need to posit anything else in the story, and nor does Marx posit anything else in the story, except the feedback between wages, unemployment, unemployment, wages, profitability, growth, and then the pickup and displacement of labor back into the pool. Okay? Any questions here? Yeah. Yeah, Daniel first.
So, the fact that capital doesn't pick up people from this, or the fact that capital.
Well, first of all, at the level of abstraction we're talking about here, and Marx is talking about, it's a system as a whole. That raises a very interesting question. What is the system as a whole? If I were to draw a picture of the map of capitalism, let's say in the 1600s, I would expect that a certain population would be encompassed by it, but not all the whole world, right? But then as I begin to draw the map in the 1700s, I expect a greater population to be encompassed by it, and so on, right? So as I do that, you can see that the arena of the incorporation of societies into capitalism gets wider. Now that has an immediate implication. which is that therefore the reserve army of labor has to be understood as being located on a global scale, not on a national scale. It's on the scale at which capital operates. And when we get concrete, we have to ask the question of how these different pools of reserve armies are linked to each other. It may well be that a particular nation or particular region in a nation can have near full employment, and then you have to ask, how does labor get to that full employment? How does the reserve army get? Are there at a concrete level barriers? Within a nation, there may not be. Between nations, there are certainly. We know that. And these conditions can change over time. When Europe becomes the EU, then the barriers of mobility break down. They're never completely gone because people have to lose their culture and their friends and their family and their language and all of that. Those still exist. Until the EU becomes one German-speaking country, it's not going to happen that people can move with equal facility to every place in the EU. But they certainly can move more easily. In the United States, mobility to the north and vice versa is not without cost. There's always that friction. But you can see at an abstract level, the pool is located in different places, but we can speak about it, the United States pool, in a meaningful way. Still, the pool is very different even in New York City. There, obviously, you can go in parts of Manhattan where there's high employment, and you can walk a few blocks and you'll be in an area with very high unemployment. Certainly true in the Bronx, certainly true in Brooklyn, certainly true in Upper Manhattan, in Harlem, and so on. So we have to be concrete about the existence of this pool. And remember the second point. Employment as it's measured is not an indicator of proper unemployment. Unemployment as it's measured, because it leaves out people who are who've given up. It leaves out people who are part-time employed, doesn't treat them as part-time, it treats them as full-time. And typically, and go on the BLS, you'll see typically that if the unemployment rate today is 7.8%, the unemployment rate which takes into account partially employed workers and discouraged workers is closer to 17 or 18%, between 15 and 17, depending how you do it. That doesn't yet account for the duration of the unemployment. If you multiply it by the duration rate, you're talking something like 25%. It's an index of unemployment intensity. That's a very serious number, and that's in the most advanced country in the world. Now expand your vision, zoom out, and you begin to see that reserve army all over the world. So an interesting question arises. Not only is it maintained, but what happens if it's getting worse? One implication of the argument in Marx is that mechanization enhances the ability to displace labor. Now, it also, through profitability of the individual capitalists, may expand the scale of their production, so they may pick up more labor. So that raises the question that I mentioned last time, the third crucial issue. What is the effect of mechanization on aggregate profitability over the long run? You notice we've now made a full circle back to Smith and Ricardo's falling rate of profit. If mechanization raised aggregate profitability over time, then the displacement of labor may be offset by the pickup of labor. If, however, it lowers the profit rate over time, then the displacement of labor goes hand in hand with the displacement of labor from slower growth. The mechanization displaces labor. If it lowers profitability, it slows down the pickup of labor. And that makes the reserve army a systemic and intrinsic problem rather than a local historical one. Now, to just pursue that a little bit, because I don't have much time left, imagine this implication, that mechanization keeps accelerating. It is, by the way, now extraordinary. There are websites. I have to remember to send you all a site that keeps track of mechanization. It's run by a graduate student, I think, at Utah, or young professor at Utah. who keeps track of all the mechanizations. But every day you read in the paper a new set of mechanizations. Machines can play chess. They're going to drive cars. We already know that because the Japanese are expecting people when they come to Japan for the Olympics or whatever that you'll be, they claim, driven around by a robotic car. So there goes all the cab driver jobs, by the way. They can serve food. They can do surgery with help from a surgeon abroad, but they can do work on assembly lines. They're now making friendly robots that are slowed down so they won't frighten you and they can work with you. The Japanese are counting on robots to take care of older people, something I'm looking forward to. I want to pick my own robot, that's the only difference, but okay. Almost anything that we think of that can be done now, including what I'm doing now, can be done by robots. Universities are greatly interested in MOOCs. Everybody knows what a MOOC is, a massive online something course. Open online course. The universities don't want open. They want massive online course for pay. And the reason they want to do that is that one person could be sitting with a video camera lecturing and there could be 10,000 students with a few robots or RAs, depending on whichever is cheaper, helping with that. Now, in that future, I noticed that graduate students tend to be more worried about it than undergraduates. In my Lang class, when I bring this up, the students all imagine themselves to be that segment of the population which will be needed in the future. They come from a more privileged background, so they imagine that they will be fine. But if you look around, is it true that if mechanization continues to proceed and accelerate, that the people of the earth will be needed? Forget about yourself. Imagine that you are the one who survives all of this. Can you imagine that all 2 billion, 2.5 billion adult people in the world will be needed and increasingly needed? And if not, what is the implication? Political implication. What is the social implication? One answer is, and since I'm an economist, my job is to be pessimistic as possible. One answer is that we will get rid of the people. I think it's very sensible. If capitalist system doesn't need more people, then it may come up with mechanisms to get rid of people. There are already such mechanisms into play. There are lots of incentives for not having children. And the mechanisms which enforced childbearing on women are greatly weakened in the advanced world and rapidly being weakened elsewhere. A good thing, yes, but also consistent with the fact that we don't need people. We don't need people in the same way. Wars, get rid of excess population. Disease, get rid of excess population. And it's excess relative to the needs of a particular social system. And this is the central point, if you go back to the chapter 25, that capitalism creates an excess population according to its own rules. It's not lack of food, not lack of means of production, not lack of access to land, not lack of water. It's lack of employment under the rules of profitability. And that is the central theme, in my belief, the central implication of the idea of a persistent pool. Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot intervene in it. These are the tendencies of the system. And the question is, what can be done? What are the limits of intervention in these processes? And that's what helps to formalize them, so to speak, to help you understand these limits. Okay, questions?
The rates of mechanization should be lower or higher?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's a good question because there are two determinants of mechanization. One is that the way machines come into play is through accumulation. If I have a depression, I'm not going to mechanize because I'm not selling what I have, right? So if I have a mechanized process in the works, I just cancel it because I don't need it. I don't need the thing in what I have already. So growth introduces mechanization, so it picks up technology which is being developed potentially and makes it active. So that's a positive correlation between mechanization and the growth rate. And those are well-known sort of observations about productivity growth and GDP growth, Okun's law kind of things, right? And then there's a second part, which is that if the wage share rises, there's more room to displace labor because you save more money if labor is expensive by displacing a worker, right? So the rate of mechanization speeds up relative to any given growth rate, implementation rate, through this endogenous loop. Now, of course, mechanization has a third element, which is discoveries, though they are seldom as accidental as they appear to be in the telling. They're often things have been looked for and are ready to be implemented. So those three elements all work in practice together, but the key point is that growth is speeded up by profitability, but the rate of mechanization, the pickup rate of machines is speeded up, but the rate of invention might be speeded up when wages rise and profitability declines. Okay? Yes?
You know, one area that I think a lot about is Southern Europe, but of course it's experiencing extreme levels of.
No, but it's a good question. Well, let me repose it. Why is this massive pool not being employed? Now, one can imagine that there are social conditions in which it could be employed. And Keynes talked about possibilities, and societies have invented many conditions, including wars and creation of pyramids and so on, where you can employ people. The limit is profitability. Now, that could therefore be that by increasing profitability, you could create more employment. I happen to believe, in fact, that the Reagan boom, which was caused by smashing unions and lowering the wage and increasing the rate of surplus value, we know that it increased the rate of growth also. So there is their answer, which is that if we increase profitability, we'll increase employment. I think that's true within limits. I also think that the unemployment crisis in Europe, which is a Great Depression, will pass. So this is a rare moment of optimism on my part, but I do believe that these episodes pass. However, when they pass, we're going to come into a future where mechanization is greatly enhanced. And so we don't come back to what we had before. And if we come back with the same growth rate of labor supply, we'll have a much worse problem, which is why the pressure has been on the growth rate of the labor supply for a long time now. It's not resources. That's the fictitious story. We don't have enough resources in the world. Well, if we as Americans cut our consumption by half, we'd have plenty of resources. We're the cause of that. It's the population. And the population relative to the employment possibilities. So you can cut back on the population. It's entirely possible, by the way, that populations will be eliminated. I have a good friend who's Italian, and I would say to him, look at the growth rate in Italy. You're the last Italian that's going to be, because the growth rate is so low. It's below reproduction. And it's below reproduction for most income classes in the advanced world, and even in the developing world. Educated people are not reproducing. So here's a very interesting historical thing, that we have arrived at a point where we self-extinguish. Machinery is going to help, because those of us who don't do that, we're going to be replaced by machines at a greater rate. Where this can end up is not clear. And you know, I want to emphasize this is the same ambiguity at the end of Smith about what happens with the falling rate of profit. In Marx now you have a falling rate of profit and a mechanization rate. What happens? All of this is conditional on this social system. And that's the key point. Marx, if he was here, could jump up and say, but I don't mean that humanity is doomed. I mean that capitalism is doomed. That's a different implication.